The day the rancher found the tiny foal was the kind of day folks around town would later talk about with lowered voices. Not because of any danger or trouble, but because no one understood why he stopped at that old livestock yard in the first place. The sky was pale, the fences were leaning, and most of the animals looked worn from a long season. Yet something in the air held a strange pull, almost like the land itself was nudging him toward a moment he wasn't expecting. The rancher had come only to trade feed and check prices, but he ended up stepping into a story that would follow him for the rest of his days. He walked through the rows of animals with his hands in his pockets, studying them the way a man studies the weather before a storm. Most were ordinary stock. Some were too old to work, some too wild to handle. None of them caught his attention until he reached the far corner of the yard. There, tied to a post with a piece of frayed rope, stood the smallest foal he had ever seen. It looked hardly bigger than a dog, its ribs showing through its thin coat. The foal's head hung low, and its legs trembled like it had been standing far too long. It didn't lift its eyes even when he stepped closer. The rancher paused, trying to understand why such a small creature was even here. A man at the yard called out that foal wasn't worth much. Too weak to grow strong, too fragile to work, too small to fetch any real price. No one wanted it. The rancher listened quietly. He didn't know much about that foal's past, but he knew the look of something that had been left behind. It stirred a feeling he couldn't name, something that reminded him of old losses and long days on the range. Before he even realized he was reaching for his pocket, he asked what the price was. The man shrugged and said 50 cents. Not even enough to buy a cup of warm coffee. People nearby chuckled, shaking their heads at the thought of anyone paying for such a weak thing. But the rancher didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He simply placed 2 quarters on the table and took the rope in his hand. The foal didn't resist. It only swayed slightly, as if unsure whether it still had the strength to stand. The rancher whispered to it gently and led it toward his wagon, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope. Some folks at the yard murmured as he passed, wondering why he'd waste effort on an animal so close to giving up. A few said he was a kind man, others said he was a fool, but none of them would have guessed what that foal would one day become. The rancher didn't care what they thought. He lifted the foal into the wagon carefully and settled it on a blanket. For a moment, the small creature blinked up at him with tired eyes that held a hint of something steady deep inside. It wasn't strength, not yet, but it was something close. On the long ride home, the foal rested quietly, only shifting once when the wagon hit a rough patch. The rancher kept glancing back at it, wondering what kind of life the little thing had before this. He didn't know whether it had been born too early, or whether its mother had been lost, or whether it had simply been overlooked for too long. All he knew was that it was in his care now, and he would do what he could. As the miles passed, the land around him grew familiar again. Fences he had repaired, trees he had grown up under, pastures that carried both good memories and hard ones. When he reached the ranch, he carried the foal inside the barn where the air was warm and the ground soft. He wrapped it in fresh blankets and placed a bucket of water nearby. The other horses watched quietly from their stalls, sensing something unusual. The foal lifted its head a little, noticing the sounds of the barn, the steady breathing of the older horses, and the gentle rustle of hay falling from the rafters. It was the first moment it showed a sign of waking spirit, a flicker of awareness that hinted at more than weakness. As night settled in, the rancher checked on it several times. He spoke to it in a calm voice, letting it learn the sound of someone who cared. The foal tried to stand once but fell back gently, its legs too shaky to hold its weight. The rancher knelt beside it and steadied it with his hands. He felt the tremble of its small body, the fragile heartbeat, and the faint hope pushing through. He promised himself he would not let the little creature fade away like so many things already had on this land. By morning, the ranch hands were already talking about the foal. Some were curious, others doubtful. A few suggested he had spent 50 cents too many. But when they saw the rancher standing beside the foal with quiet determination, they didn't say much else. They knew from experience that once he set his mind to something, he didn't back down easily. And though the foal was tiny and weak and struggling, there was something about it that drew attention. Something that made even the skeptical men stop and watch for a moment. Over the next several days, the rancher worked tirelessly. He fed the foal carefully, kept it warm, and stayed up late to make sure it didn't slip deeper into weakness during the night. Little by little, the foal began to respond. It lifted its head more often. It took small sips of water. It leaned into the rancher's hand as though recognizing him. Every tiny improvement felt like a step toward something none of them understood yet. Still, not everyone believed in the foal's future. A neighbor stopped by one afternoon, leaning against the fence with a doubtful look. He said that no small creature like that could grow strong, no matter how much care it received. He warned the rancher not to expect much. He said it was best to focus energy on animals that could carry weight, pull wagons, or ride the trails. The rancher listened quietly, then simply thanked him for dropping by. Later that night, as the rancher filled a lantern and walked toward the barn, he noticed something odd near the far fence line, footprints, several of them. They were spaced far apart, too wide to belong to a child, too narrow for any ranch hand he knew. They looked like someone had been pacing, watching, waiting. The rancher frowned and followed the prints for a short distance, but they vanished into the tall grass before he could make sense of them. He turned back to the barn with a strange feeling tightening in his chest. The foal was lying quietly on the blanket, but its ears were alert. It lifted its head when he entered and stared at him with an intensity he hadn't seen before. Something in its eyes felt different, stronger, more aware, as though the little creature sensed something happening outside the barn that neither of them fully understood. The rancher sat beside it and rested his hand gently on its back. For a moment, everything felt calm. The soft sound of horses breathing, the faint creaking of the barn walls, the steady glow of the lantern. But that sense of calm didn't last long. The breeze outside shifted, carrying a faint sound across the yard. Not a howl, not a voice, but something uneasy. Something that raised the hair on the rancher's arms. He stood up slowly, listening. The foal's ears tilted toward the doorway, its body tightening. Something out there was stirring. Something that didn't belong to the peaceful night. The rancher stepped outside, scanning the darkness, realizing that saving the foal might bring more to his life than he ever expected. He didn't know yet whether it would bring trouble or fortune, but the air felt charged, like the beginning of a story that was far from ordinary. And as the wind pushed through the grass, the rancher sensed that whatever was coming had already begun. The days that followed moved slow, the kind of slow only an old ranch town understood. Dust rolled down the roads in lazy curls, and the mornings came with a gray hush that hung over the plains. The rancher woke before sunrise each day, stirred by the familiar creak of the windmill and the faint shuffle of animals shifting in their pens. He liked the quiet, though lately it carried a strange edge, as if something was waiting in the stillness. Ever since he brought that tiny foal home for $50, the land felt different. Not in a loud or troubling way, but like the world was paying attention to him in a way it never had before. The foal had settled in easier than he expected. It followed him around the yard, light on its small hooves, alert and curious. It had a way of watching him that felt almost knowing. Folks in town had joked that he wasted good money, even if it was only spare change. But he found himself drawn to the little thing. Maybe it was the way the foal's coat shined when the sun caught it, or maybe it was the quiet strength beneath its frail appearance. Either way, it seemed to carry a spark he couldn't explain. As the rancher moved through his daily chores, he couldn't shake the memory of the man who sold him the foal. There had been something off in the stranger's stare, something heavy behind his words. The rancher kept playing the moment back, trying to understand why the man had practically pushed the foal onto him, claiming he had no use for the animal. The stranger hadn't even looked back once the deal was done. He had walked away as if washing his hands of something. The rancher tried to let it go, telling himself that folks behaved in all sorts of odd ways. Out here, long miles and long days could twist a man into shapes he didn't intend. He focused instead on the land, tending to fences and checking water lines, but the feeling clung to him like a burr. Whenever he knelt to refill the foal's trough or brush dirt from its soft coat, he felt the weight of a story he didn't yet know. The land around his ranch had seen its share of tales, whispered from one generation to the next. Old-timers spoke about hidden trails, lost gold, and horses that carried secrets in their bloodlines. Most of those stories drifted off on the wind, half believed and half forgotten. But the rancher had always been the sort who listened close, collecting every little detail. Lately, those old stories returned to him in pieces, circling in his thoughts like hawks searching the ground. One afternoon he saddled up his older mare and decided to check the far pasture. The foal followed behind the fence, trotting back and forth, not wanting him to leave. Its small whinny echoed across the yard, and he felt a tug of something he couldn't name. He gave a small wave, hoping it would calm the colt, then headed toward the rolling hills where the grass grew tall and wild. The ride took him past the cottonwoods, where the creek ran low but steady. He noticed fresh hoofprints along the muddy bank. They didn't belong to his horses, and they didn't match the tracks of cattle either. He crouched beside them, brushing away loose dirt with his fingers. These prints were sharper, deeper, made by animals moving fast. Wild horses maybe, though he hadn't seen a band near his ranch in some time. Still, the idea made his pulse quicken. Something was stirring on his land. As he rode farther, he noticed another odd detail. Sections of his fence were bowed out, as if something had pressed hard against them from the inside. But there was no sign that his own herd had come near the spot. It looked more like animals tried to get in rather than out. The thought sat heavy in his mind. Wild horses didn't usually crowd into fenced land unless something pushed them. He spent a good part of the day riding along the property line, studying the ground and the tall grass, letting the wind guide his attention. The more he looked, the more he felt an invisible pull, as if a trail was waiting for him to follow. But the sun began to dip low, and he knew he needed to get back before nightfall. Coyotes had been moving bold lately, and he didn't want the foal left alone too long. By the time he returned to the ranch, the foal stood right at the gate, ears perked, pacing the ground. When it saw him, it ran forward, bumping gently against his leg. He knelt and ran his hand along the foal's neck, calming it. The animal trembled a little, as if it sensed something brewing around them, something it didn't yet understand. That night, the rancher lit a lantern and sat at his old wooden table, staring at a map that had belonged to his father. The lines were faded, but the landmarks still held true. Every ridge, every creek, every hollow was marked with careful strokes. He traced the area where he found the strange hoofprints. The section didn't have any notes, just a plain stretch of land, untouched and unremarkable. Yet he knew something had walked there recently, something strong and restless. The house creaked as the night wind picked up. He heard the low whicker of the foal from outside, uneasy again. He stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand, and scanned the darkness. The ranch stretched wide around him, its familiar shapes swallowed in shadow. He listened long, the kind of listening ranchers learn from years of living with quiet things. At first he heard nothing but the steady pulse of the night. Then came the faint thundering, distant but real, like hooves drumming against the hard earth. He stiffened. The sound grew stronger, not in anger but in urgency, a herd moving fast. Wild horses heading toward his land, but why? He stayed on the porch until the sound faded into the hills. The foal pressed close against the gate, breathing hard. He walked out and placed a steadying hand along its side. It leaned into him, warm and trembling. He whispered soft words, trying to ease its fear. But the truth was, he felt it too. In the following days, the tension on the ranch thickened like the air before a storm. The foal grew stronger, healthier, and surprisingly sure-footed. It learned the layout of the ranch quick, moving with a confidence that didn't match its size. Sometimes it would stop and stare toward the hills, ears sharp, as if waiting for something to return. The rancher kept working, but his thoughts drifted back to the wild tracks he had seen. He rode out again, checking the fence line, the grass, and the creek. More signs appeared. Brush pushed aside, stones kicked loose. Trails flattened by heavy movement, it didn't feel like chance. It felt like a path leading him somewhere he had never been. As he followed the trail deeper one afternoon, he found something that made him pull his reins hard. There in the dust lay a small, weathered piece of leather, torn at the edge. It looked like part of a halter, but old, too old to belong to anyone nearby. He picked it up and turned it in his hand. The stitching was unusual, unlike the work done in town. It belonged to someone who knew horses in a different way, someone who worked close to wild bloodlines. Something in him tightened. He slipped the leather into his saddlebag and continued forward. The land stretched open, quiet and expectant, as if holding its breath. Every step made him more certain that the foal was not just a random buy or a lucky bargain. It was tied to a story far bigger than what he saw on the surface. The sun dipped low, washing the land in gold. He felt the air shift, carrying a faint rumble. This time it was closer than before. The sound wrapped around him, steady and powerful. He didn't turn back, not yet. The mystery tugged at him too strongly. He urged his moray forward, deeper into the unknown, aware that whatever waited just ahead had already set its sights on him. And he had no idea how much his life was about to change. The rancher rode back the next morning with a restlessness he couldn't shake. Sleep had barely touched him through the night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the foal standing alone in the moonlit yard, ears pricked toward the distant hills. The sound of those wild hoofs had worked its way into his dreams, rising and falling like a warning he couldn't quite understand. When dawn finally broke, soft and pale, he saddled his mare again, unable to stay still for long. Something was moving on his land, and he needed to know what it was. The foal stayed near the barn while he prepared, watching him with wide, alert eyes. It kept shifting its weight, unsettled by the morning air. The rancher knelt and ran a hand along its neck, feeling the warmth of its skin and the steady rhythm of its breath. Yet beneath the calm surface he sensed a quiet tension. The foal lifted its head toward the hills again, as though listening for something he couldn't hear. He promised he'd be back before nightfall and mounted up, heading toward the far ridge where the trail of tracks had led him the day before. The mare trotted steady beneath him, familiar with the land, though she too seemed cautious. She tossed her head at every sudden rustle, every shift of wind through the grass. Even the birds were quieter than usual, perched high with wings folded, as if watching the plains below them. By the time he reached the edge of the ridge, the tracks had grown clearer. More hoofprints than before, overlapping in deep patterns. A whole herd had moved this way, not long ago. He dismounted and crouched beside the tracks, brushing dirt aside with careful fingers, fresh, maybe no more than an hour or two old, and they weren't wandering aimlessly. They were heading west in a straight line as if following something. He stood, dusting his hands, and scanned the horizon. The land opened wide in every direction, rolling hills fading into distant valleys. Nothing moved out there except the wind sweeping across the tall grass. But he felt eyes on him, or maybe it was just his own nerves tightening around him. He followed the trail for another mile before something unexpected caught his attention. Near a clump of twisted shrubs lay a series of rope fragments, frayed and worn. They were fresh too, still holding the smell of sweat and leather. Someone had tried to rope the wild horses. The ropes didn't look like the work of a ranch hand. These were thicker, tied with knots he didn't recognize. He crouched again, turning the pieces over. The realization sank deeper than he wanted to admit. Someone was out here tracking the wild herd, and judging by the broken ropes scattered around, they were having trouble controlling them. He straightened, looking around the open land. Whoever had been here wasn't far. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the cold awareness of being watched. His mare stomped the ground, uneasy. He steadied her, glancing toward the hills. He didn't see anyone, but he knew better than to trust the calm. He rode back slowly, taking a wider loop around the property. He wanted to make sure no one had crossed onto his land while he'd been away. With each passing hour, the unease grew, settling deep in his chest. The wild herd wasn't the only mystery now. Someone else had an interest in them, and possibly in the small foal that had somehow ended up in his hands. When he reached the ranch, the foal stood near the gate again, but this time its eyes were fixed on something beyond the fence. Its ears twitched, its muscles tight. The rancher followed its gaze, scanning the distance. At first, he didn't see anything, but then he spotted movement near the rise. A silhouette of a rider, faint against the winter-blue sky, watching the ranch from far away. The figure didn't move, didn't wave. Just sat there on horseback, still as a stone. The rancher's heart thudded. He took a slow breath, trying not to spook the foal. The rider turned a moment later, guiding the horse toward the west until the figure disappeared behind the ridge. The rancher tightened his grip on the gate. Whoever it was, they knew where to look, and that meant they likely knew about the foal. Over the next few days, odd things kept happening around the ranch. Nothing loud or obvious, but enough to notice. Tools shifted from where he left them. A latch on the barn door stood open in the morning when he knew he'd closed it. Tracks of a single horse circled the property, stopping near the outer fence line as though someone had ridden there at night. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the signs pointed one way. Someone was scouting the ranch, checking its boundaries, watching him, watching the foal. The rancher kept the young horse close by, making sure it never wandered far. As the days passed, the foal grew stronger and more confident. Its legs steadied, its muscles filled out, and its stride took on a rhythm that echoed the wild herds he'd heard at night. It started moving with a natural grace that didn't belong to ordinary stock. Anyone could see it now. The foal was special, carrying something rare in its bloodline. One evening, as the sky turned deep orange, he heard the distant thunder of hooves again, louder this time, closer. The foal lifted its head sharply, eyes wide. The rancher stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon. Dust rose along the far side of the ranch, billowing like smoke. A herd was running, fast. He moved to the fence, heart pounding. The sound grew, filling the land with a deep rumble, but the herd never appeared. The thunder stopped suddenly, the dust settled, and silence washed over the plains. The rancher stood there, breathing hard, feeling a chill crawl through him. That night he barely slept. He kept a rifle nearby, though he hoped he would never need it. The foal rested near the barn, but every so often it lifted its head, ears flicking toward the hills. Something was calling to it, or maybe warning it. The next morning, he saddled up and decided to search the west ridge again, where the rider had appeared before. As he reached the ridge, he found tracks of several horses, deeper and more chaotic than before. They cut across the land in sharp patterns, as if the herd had been startled or driven. He followed the trail and soon came across a clearing where patches of grass had been flattened. More rope fragments lay scattered there. Someone had tried to round up the herd by force, and it had not gone well. A sound broke the silence. The rancher froze, listening. A twig snapped behind a row of brush. He reached for the Murray's reins, ready to turn back. But then a voice drifted through the still air, low, hoarse, and tired. "You shouldn't be here." The rancher turned slowly. A man stepped out from behind the brush, leaning heavily on a walking stick. His clothes were worn, his hat pulled low, his boots dusty from long travel. He didn't look like a threat, but there was something wary in his eyes. The rancher kept his voice steady. "I'm checking my land. Looks like someone else has been here." The stranger nodded. "Not someone, several. They're after the herd." "And they're not the kind who give up easy?" The rancher studied him carefully. "Why come to me?" The man hesitated. "Because they'll come for the foal next." The rancher felt a jolt. "You know about the foal?" The man let out a slow breath. "I know a lot about that little one. More than you'd want to hear out here." He glanced around the plains. "Too many years on this land." The rancher's grip tightened on the reins. "Then tell me what I need to know." The man shook his head. "Not yet. But you should be ready. The herd isn't running without reason. And the folks chasing them aren't after ordinary horses." He stepped back toward the brush. "Keep that foal close. And don't trust the quiet. It's lying to you." Before the rancher could ask another question, the man disappeared into the trees. The words lingered in the air, heavy with warning. The rancher stood alone on the ridge, a cold wind sweeping over the land. The foal was tied to something deeper than he'd ever imagined, and now strangers roamed the hills, tracking both the wild herd and his ranch. The conflict was no longer just about understanding the foal's past. It had become about protecting it from whatever force was closing in, whatever danger stirred the plains at night. And he knew this was only the beginning of something much larger, something he could feel gathering around him like a storm he couldn't outrun. The rancher rode back toward home with the stranger's warning echoing in his mind. The land looked calm as ever, touched by the late afternoon light, but something felt different. Every shadow seemed longer, Every gust of wind sounded sharper. The quiet pressed too hard against his ears, as if hiding something underneath it. He kept scanning the hills, expecting to see that lone rider again, or worse, a whole line of unfamiliar horses. But the plain stretched empty all the way to the horizon. When the ranch came into view, the foal stood near the corral, head lifted as if it had sensed him before he even arrived. The young horse paced, restless. Its ears twitched toward the same west ridge he had just returned from. The rancher swung down from his mare and walked toward it. The foal nudged his arm, breathing fast, like it carried the same unease simmering in his own chest. He whispered calm words, though he didn't feel calm himself. He checked the barn next, and the unease deepened. The latch he had fixed 2 days ago had been moved again. Not broken this time, but handled. Someone had been close enough to touch the door. The rancher knelt to the dirt and saw fresh boot prints mixed with horse tracks. Whoever was watching the ranch had come close. Too close. He moved through the barn, checking the stalls, checking every corner, making sure nothing else had been disturbed. Everything inside seemed untouched, but the air felt different, heavier. He tried to shake off the tension, but it stayed with him. He kept picturing the stranger on the ridge, leaning on that walking stick, telling him the quiet was lying. It didn't take much now for the rancher to believe those words. That night he barely closed his eyes. He sat on the porch with a lantern burning low and the foal lying near the barn. The sky above stretched full of stars, but even under all that light the land felt darker than usual. Every so often the foal lifted its head, alert, and the rancher would stand, ready to face whatever was out there. Hours passed, and though nothing approached, he could feel the tension tightening around the ranch like a rope being pulled. When dawn finally arrived, he knew he couldn't wait anymore. He had to find answers. The stranger had spoken as if he knew the herd, knew the threat, and maybe even knew exactly why the foal was so important. The rancher decided to search for him. He saddled his mare, tied the foal gently to a lead rope, and set out. He didn't want to leave the little horse behind again. Not while someone was roaming the land? The west ridge came into view, rising into the bright morning sky. He followed the trail from the day before, scanning for signs of the stranger. It felt risky, bringing the foal along, but the rancher's gut told him it was safer to keep it close. Every few minutes he checked over his shoulder, making sure they were alone. He reached the clearing where he had found the rope fragments. More tracks cut across the ground now. The herd had circled back at some point, the imprint of hooves pressed deep into the earth, and mixed with them were sharper prints, riders, several riders. The rancher dismounted, heart tightening. Whoever was after the herd was closing in, and they weren't trying to hide anymore. He walked farther into the clearing. A broken piece of leather lay in the grass, torn like something had yanked it free with serious force. Beyond that, the branches of several shrubs had been snapped off. A struggle had happened here. He crouched to study the ground, and that's when he heard it. A faint rustle, not the wind, not an animal, human steps. He rose slowly, keeping his voice steady. "If you're planning to introduce yourself, now's a good time." A tired sigh answered him. The same voice from the day before. The stranger stepped out from behind a thicket, his walking stick tapping the ground. His shoulders slumped slightly, as though he'd been waiting a long time. His eyes drifted toward the foal, and the rancher noticed the mix of respect and worry in his expression. "You brought it with you," the stranger said. "I'm not leaving it alone anymore," the rancher replied. "You said they'll come for it." The stranger nodded, his gaze darkening. "They're getting close. I've been following them since before they crossed into this land. They know the herd carries more value than anyone has dared to speak aloud. And that little one there? It's the key to something they've been chasing for years." The rancher shifted, uneasy. "I don't understand. You will," the stranger said quietly. "But not all at once." He motioned toward a narrow path leading down between the hills. "Walk with me. There's something you need to see." The rancher hesitated, but the stranger's tone held no threat. He guided the mare and the foal down the path, moving carefully over loose gravel. The stranger walked ahead, leaning on his stick but moving steady, as if he'd traveled these hills for decades. They reached a hollow tucked between rising slopes. It was a natural shelter, protected from the wind and hidden from anyone looking down from above. The ground had been disturbed recently, hoofprints layered over each other, and at the center a long drag mark cut through the dirt. The stranger knelt beside it. They tried to capture one of the wild ones here, a big stallion. He fought them off, but not before they managed to tag him. Tag him? The rancher echoed. The stranger pointed to the dirt where a small metal piece lay half buried. The rancher picked it up. The metal felt cold despite the sun. A symbol was etched into it. Sharp, unfamiliar, nothing like a ranch brand. More like a private mark, the kind used by people who wanted to stay unseen. "Those men aren't ranchers," the stranger said. "They're traders and not the honest kind. They've been hunting the herd, hoping to capture their leader. That stallion is the father of your foal." The rancher felt something shift inside him, a weight he hadn't been ready for. "So they want the young one because ... because it carries the best of the bloodline," the stranger finished. "Speed, strength, instincts sharper than anything most ranchers ever see. That little horse won't just grow into something strong. It'll grow into something unforgettable." The rancher looked at the foal, which stood close to his leg, watching the hollow with cautious eyes. It seemed to understand more than a young horse should. The stranger's words echoed in the air. Something unforgettable. Something worth chasing. "If those men get close enough to grab the foal," the stranger said with a hard edge, "they won't stop until they control the whole herd. And once they do, they'll sell those horses across the territory for prices normal folks can't even dream of. They don't care who gets hurt." The rancher clenched his jaw. "They won't get the foal. Then you better get ready," the stranger said. "Because they're closing in from the north," the rancher stiffened. "How do you know?" The stranger looked toward the ridge. "Because I saw their smoke at sunrise." The rancher swallowed, a cold feeling crawling through his chest. "How many are there?" "More than yesterday," the stranger answered. "And they're riding hard." For a long moment the rancher didn't speak. The foal pressed its nose against his arm again, seeking reassurance. The rancher placed a steady hand on its neck, feeling the warmth beneath its growing strength. Finally, he looked up at the stranger. "If they're coming, I'm not running." The stranger studied him, then nodded, as though that was the answer he had expected. "Then you'll need help." "From who?" the rancher asked. The stranger gave a small, tired smile. "From the herd." Before the rancher could ask what that meant, the stranger gestured for him to follow again. They climbed another narrow ridge. At the top, the land opened wide below them, stretching like a great field of gold. And there, in the distance, a wave of motion shimmered across the plains. The wild herd. Dozens of powerful horses ran in a tight formation, their manes streaming in the wind, their hooves pounding in a rhythm that carried across the land. They weren't running in fear this time. They were moving with purpose, with unity. And leading them was the stallion, tall, commanding, eyes sharp as fire. The rancher felt his breath catch. The stallion lifted its head, sensing the foal even from afar. The stranger whispered, "He knows. And he's coming." The rancher felt the tension rise inside him, thickening the air. The traders were riding in from the north. The wild herd was charging from the east. The foal was the heart of it all. Everything was moving toward one moment, one collision. He didn't know how it would unfold, but he knew the land had begun to shift under the weight of it, pushing the story toward a point where every choice would matter. Suspense tightened around him like a storm ready to break. And the rancher stood there, waiting for whatever came next. The dust from the final clash settled slowly. For a long moment no one spoke. The tension that had wrapped itself around everyone during the climax finally loosened like a knot coming undone. The air felt different now, softer, calmer, the kind of calm that comes only after a storm has spent every drop of its strength. A warm light filtered through the broken clouds above, touching the ground with a gentle glow. It almost felt like a quiet promise that things were finally going to change for the better. After everything that had happened, they all needed that promise. They needed something that felt like hope. Ayan stood at the center of the clearing, chest rising and falling with slow breaths. His hands still trembled from the power he had released, but there was no fear in his eyes anymore, only relief. The threat that had pushed him to the edge was gone. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe without pressure in his chest. Myra rushed toward him, her steps small at first, as if she could not believe it was real. When she reached him, she threw her arms around his shoulders. The hug was tight, almost shaking, and Ayan wrapped his arms around her in return. Neither said anything. They did not need to. The embrace itself said everything. They were safe. They were alive. They had made it. Rafi and Zoya joined them a moment later. Both looked worn out, but their smiles were bright and real. Zoya wiped sweat from her forehead and laughed under her breath. Not the loud kind of laugh, but the kind that escaped when someone is finally relieved after carrying a fear for too long. Rafi stepped forward and clapped Ayan on the back with a proud grin. He did not hide the emotion in his voice when he said that he always believed Ayan would find the strength to end the threat. Ayan shook his head gently and told him he never did it alone. Every step he took with them. That was the truth. Their friendship had held him steady, even when he felt like falling. Slowly, the people who had taken shelter during the fight began to emerge from behind the rocks and trees. Their faces carried fear at first, but the moment they saw the group standing safely, their expressions softened. A few of them clapped. Some whispered prayers of thanks. A little boy ran up to Myra and hugged her leg before darting back to his mother, who smiled in gratitude. The danger that had cast a shadow over their lives was finally gone. The village, the families, the land they loved, all of it was safe now. Ayan looked around at the faces watching him. He knew he was no hero in the traditional sense. He had simply followed his heart and done what felt right. But seeing them look at him with such trust and appreciation touched something deep inside him. It reminded him that courage is not about never being afraid. It is about choosing to act even when fear tries to take over. After checking that no one was injured, the group began to walk back toward the village. The path felt lighter under their feet. The trees that once seemed gloomy now swayed gently with the breeze. The river nearby made a soft flowing sound that had been drowned by noise earlier. Ayan noticed small things again. The birds moving through branches, the scent of earth after a long struggle, the kind of details people only notice when their hearts finally settle. Back in the village, families ran to greet them. Children surrounded Rafi, asking him to tell the story of the battle. He made his voice dramatic and exaggerated for them, and their laughter filled the air like music. Zoya helped an elderly couple to their seats and checked if they needed water. Myra tried to calm a group of worried mothers by telling them everything was truly over. Ayan stood near the center of the village square, soaking in the warmth around him. Even the houses, old and simple, seemed brighter today. Life had returned. He saw his mother walking toward him with tears in her eyes, and she wrapped him in an embrace without saying a single word. He held her close, grateful that he got the chance to return to her safe. As afternoon light settled on the rooftops, a small celebration began. There was no grand ceremony. Just people sharing food, stories, and smiles. Ayan and his friends sat together on wooden benches, plates in hand, watching the families enjoy the peace they had fought so hard to protect. Myra leaned close to Ayan and told him quietly that she always knew he carried a brave heart, even when he doubted it himself. He looked at her with a soft smile and replied that her faith had been the anchor that kept him steady. Her cheeks warmed at his words, and she looked down for a moment, hiding a smile. Rafi lifted his cup and announced loudly that they deserved a moment to celebrate victory and new beginnings. The crowd cheered. Someone played a soft melody on a flute, and children started dancing around the square. Their small feet tapped lightly on the ground, and everyone clapped along to the rhythm. As night approached, the sky changed to warm shades of orange and gold. The last rays of sunlight painted the horizon with a peaceful glow. Ayan felt grateful for everything. Not just for survival, but for growth. For the lessons the struggle had taught him. For the bonds that had become stronger through hardship. Later, when most of the crowd had gone home, Ayan and Myra took a quiet walk toward the hill overlooking the village. The wind was gentle and carried the scent of fresh grass. They sat on a large rock and watched the lights from the houses flicker softly in the distance. Myra asked him what he planned to do next now that the threat was gone. Ayan thought about it for a moment. He said he wanted to help rebuild the village and guide others so they could feel empowered and safe again. He wanted to use what he learned to bring hope instead of fear. Myra nodded and told him she wanted to stand with him every step of the way. Ayan felt his heart lighten. He looked at the sky above them. The stars were bright and calm. For the first time in a long while, they did not feel distant. They felt like reminders that, even in darkness, light always finds a way. The challenges they had faced had changed all of them. They had learned the importance of unity, trust, and compassion. They had discovered that real strength comes not from power alone, but from intention and love. The journey had been long and heavy, but the ending was filled with hope and renewal. By the time they walked back down the hill, the village was quiet. Ayan glanced around at the peaceful homes and knew this was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with growth, healing, and dreams that had room to breathe again. As he reached his door and looked back one more time at the night sky, he smiled. His story had reached its end, but the future stretched wide in front of him. A future built on courage, kindness, and the belief that even after the hardest battles, happiness can rise again. And now, everything felt ready for a new beginning.